Welcome back, everyone,
Oh,
for another deep dive with us. We've been on this journey through the Quran, really digging deep,
yeah.
but today we're kind of shifting gears a bit.
Yeah, taking a little bit of a sidestep into the world of hadith.
Exactly. It's still connected, obviously,
Oh, absolutely.
but we're going to be looking at the system of grading hadith, and I think people can be pretty surprised by what they hear.
Yeah, I think when people think about hadith, it's very much, authentic or not authentic,
Right.
sahih or deef, and that's as far as it goes.
Yeah, good or bad. Yeah, simple as that.
Right. And today we're going to show you that it's a little bit more complicated than that. There's a lot more to it. It's really fascinating when you dig into the layers of the grading system.
Yeah.
A blend of historical context, methodologies, and even just, religious beliefs,
Right.
which all kind of come together to create this really rich tapestry.
So you've got this kind of clash between modern textual criticism, which tries to be all objective and scientific,
Mm.
and then you have these traditional Islamic methods for verifying hadiths that are very much rooted in faith.
It's a real collision of worldviews, isn't it? And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating to explore.
Even if you're coming at it from a purely academic, non-religious perspective like we are.
Precisely.
So for those of you who might be new to all of this,
Yeah.
what are we even talking about when we say hadith grading?
So, in the traditional Islamic approach, the focus is really on the reputation of the people who transmitted the hadith. We're talking about those narrators in that chain of transmission.
Right, like a chain of whispers going back through time.
Exactly. So the idea is a good hadith, one that's considered reliable, came from a line of devout, trustworthy Muslims, people with good memories who knew each other personally.
So basically like a historical game of telephone.
Kinda, yeah. Except there's this big assumption built into that.
What it is?
Well, it relies on this romanticized view of how oral tradition works. It assumes a level of accuracy and consistency that, well,
History has shown us isn't always the case.
exactly. Memories can be fuzzy.
Yeah. Telephone as a kid, the message got pretty distorted.
Yeah, it's a nice idea that oral traditions are perfect, but not quite how it works in reality when you really look at it historically.
So we've got this idealized system that's maybe a little too idealistic. What does the actual grading system look like on the ground?
Well, to be totally honest, the modern Islamic grading system, it's a bit of a mishmash of things.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like they took pieces from earlier systems and you end up with this collection of grades that sometimes overlap and sometimes point to different,
Or even conflicting ways.
yeah, conflicting ways of verifying a hadith.
So it's not just one neat and tidy system.
Not at all. And to make things even more confusing, these days people tend to oversimplify it all, like
Right.
boiling it down to just those three categories.
Sahih Hassan and Daif.
Exactly. Authentic, good, and weak.
It sounds almost like, a rating system you'd see on like a movie review site.
Right. But it's not that simple.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to that dive category, there's this really common misconception that dive just automatically means garbage, like it's something to be completely dismissed.
But from what we've been looking at, that's not the whole story, is it?
Definitely not. In fact, Da'if hadiths actually make up a pretty significant portion of those canonical hadith
I'm
collections.
talking about the core texts here.
Yeah, the essential texts, even the 6 major ones. So if you look at those 4 major books outside of Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim,
Right.
they actually contain something like 21% to 25% Da'if hadiths.
Wow.
And if you go back even further, like look at collections like Musnad Ahmad and Muwatta Imam Malik, that percentage jumps to like 28% to 38%.
So that's a sizable chunk of those essential texts that are labeled daif. Doesn't really sound like they thought it was worthless if they included that much, right?
It really doesn't. Which brings up a big question. If the scholars who compiled these collections actually thought Da'if meant garbage, why would they even include them?
It seems like a contradiction.
Right. Because their whole purpose was to preserve the Prophet's teachings, right?
Right.
So why would they include all the stuff they thought was fake or unreliable? It's kind of ironic when you think about it. These books were compiled to preserve authentic hadiths and fight against fabrications,
Right.
but to then dismiss a large portion of their content as unreliable
Uh-huh.
because it falls under this broad category of da'if. It seems a little extreme, to say the least.
Yeah. So it makes you wonder, did daif always mean what we think it means today? Like maybe weak isn't the best translation.
Yeah, I think there's a good argument to be made that Da'if didn't carry that same negative connotation in the past.
Hmm.
That maybe it just meant, okay, this hadith needs a closer look, more scrutiny. Not that it's completely worthless.
Right. And, it's interesting because when you think about it, this emphasis on authenticity as like the primary grading criterion,
Yes.
it really seems to have started with Bukhari and Muslim,
Right.
who, if I remember correctly, were teacher and student.
They were. Exactly. So you can see how their approach would have a major impact on how hadith were viewed and categorized.
So are you saying this whole obsession with authenticity might be a later development?
It's very possible. It's not necessarily something that was inherent to the tradition from the very beginning. There are scholars who suggest that, the concept of authenticity as we understand it today might actually be alien to earlier methodologies.
Wow. That's a pretty radical idea when you think about it.
Yeah.
So maybe this modern idea that Dawah just equals garbage, maybe that's not quite accurate. But where does that idea even come from? Why do people think that?
Well, I think that's where this clash we were talking about earlier between traditional religious views and modern thinking really comes into play.
Yeah.
Some scholars actually argue that this aversion to Dawah hadiths that we see today, it stems from this discomfort that some people feel when those hadiths clash with
Our modern scientific understanding.
Exactly, or with how our moral and social values have evolved over time.
So it's like as science progressed, certain hadiths started to seem, I don't know, a little bit out of sync with new discoveries.
Right.
Or maybe they didn't fit with changing ideas about things like gender roles or the nature of the universe. And so there was this push to kind of distance those hadiths from the acceptable core.
Precisely. And using that Dawah label and pushing this narrative that Dawah means it's just unacceptable, it became a convenient way to do that.
So if Dawah isn't like a death sentence for a hadith, are there any grades that are truly considered unacceptable in Islam? Are there any that are just totally off limits?
Oh, absolutely. There are 3 specific grades that are huge red flags. Madu, Matruk, and Munkar.
Okay, let's break those down for our listeners so they can really see the difference here. So Madu, that seems pretty straightforward. It just means fabricated, right?
Right. Someone just made it up.
Completely made up.
Yeah. And because those are so obviously problematic, you don't usually find those Madu hadiths in those main hadith collections.
Right.
They tend to be collected kind of separately, almost to avoid any confusion.
Makes sense. You don't want to taint the others with those, right?
That's great.
Okay. What about Munkar then?
So Munkar basically means rejected. And these are hadiths that were deemed unacceptable by, those prominent Muslim scholars, sometimes way back in history, even as far back as the 9th century.
So unlike Da'if, which seems to have gotten this kind of extra layer of rejection more recently, Munkar hadiths have been on the no list for a very long time.
Exactly. And that's a really important difference because it shows how the reasons for rejecting a hadith have actually changed over time,
What might have been considered okay, or at least debatable back in the day, is now viewed completely differently because of, all sorts of factors beyond just religious doctrine.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got Madu, totally made up, Munkar rejected a long time ago. What about that last one, Matruk?
Matruk is an interesting one. It means abandoned, and it's not so much that the hadith itself is, bad or wrong. It's more about the person who transmitted it.
Oh, okay.
Their reputation is so tarnished that anything they pass down is basically thrown out.
So they were known to be a liar.
Yeah, a liar, or they had really bad memory problems, or their character was questionable. Whatever the reason, it's saying we can't trust anything this person said.
So it's guilt by association for hadiths?
Yeah. Kind of. And, even those Matruk hadiths can sometimes pop up in those major collections, almost like a little historical footnote.
But there's essentially unusable, right? If you're trying to make a point using a hadith, you'd have to find a better one.
Exactly. It's like citing a discredited scientist in a research paper.
Okay, so we've got our 3 definitely unacceptable grades, Modu, Munkar, and Matruk. And then we've got this whole range of other grades, with Da'if being a lot more nuanced than people make it out to be. Are there any other grades that kind of fall into that gray area where it's not so black and white?
Just start with the basics. How does the traditional Islamic approach even begin to tackle this whole question of grading hadiths?
Well, traditionally, the idea was that a hadith was only as good as the people who transmitted it.
Yeah. Okay.
There's this very almost romanticized notion of oral tradition going on here.
I can see that.
But, if we think about it for a second, you start to see some problems with that logic, right?
Yeah. Definitely.
Human memory isn't perfect. Personal bias can creep in.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the possibility of deliberate fabrication or embellishment along the way.
Yeah, no matter how much you revere these oral traditions,
Hmm.
there are going to be inconsistencies. I mean, that's just human nature.
So how did this traditional approach
Yeah.
kind of evolve into the, I guess, the more official grading system that a lot of Muslims use today?
Well, the modern system is sort of a mishmash of those earlier systems. It's
Right.
trying to be more standardized in how it evaluates hadiths, but honestly, it's a bit of a hodgepodge.
Really?
Yeah, you've got all these overlapping categories, which it just gets confusing.
Okay, so let's try to unpack this hodgepodge a little bit.
Okay.
Can you give us some examples of these different categories and what they actually mean?
Sure. Some of the grades, they focus specifically on problems with the chain of transmission, you know?
Yeah.
So, for example, you have disconnected, which means there's a break somewhere in the chain.
Right.
Then you have problematic, which suggests something off about one of the transmitters. Maybe their memory's not considered reliable or there are doubts about their piety. You've also got confused, where there are conflicting accounts of the same hadith.
So it's not just about whether the hadith itself sounds true or not.
Right.
It's also about the whole history of how that saying or that story got passed down.
You got it. And then you have grades for problems with the content itself. Like one of the sources we're looking at for this deep dive mentions this strange hadith about the conquest of Constantinople and Judgment Day.
Strange. In what way?
Well, this particular hadith basically ties the conquest of Constantinople to the Islamic end times,
Oh.
which, as history shows, didn't exactly pan out that way. Constantinople, or Istanbul as it's called now,
Right.
was conquered, but, you know, the world kept on spinning.
That's a pretty big oopsie, isn't it?
You could say that.
So with all these like intricate categories and classifications, it kind of seems like the whole grading system itself could be, well, a bit of a mess.
That's one way to put it. It's confusing, it's nonsensical at times, and it basically means that you have to rely on modern Islamic scholars or imams
Okay.
to tell you what it all means.
So the average Muslim just has to kind of trust these scholarly authorities.
Pretty much. And that's where it gets really interesting because most people have only heard of this simplified version of the grading system. You know, you got your Sahih for authentic, Hasan for good, and Da'if for weak.
Right. So it makes it sound like anything labeled Da'if is basically just tossed out, like it can't be trusted.
Exactly. There's definitely something to that. And it's hard not to notice that this whole push to downplay the Da'if hadith tends to happen when those hadiths say things that clash with, modern science or modern ethics.
It makes you wonder if it's more about trying to protect a certain image of Islam than actually upholding these like rigorous scholarly standards.
Yeah, it's something to think about. So we've got the obviously bad hadiths, and then the oversimplified view of the Da'if category.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking about. There's got to be some hadiths that fall somewhere in between.
Absolutely. There are two grades that are especially murky. Mudtarib, meaning confused, and shad, meaning anomalous.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What makes them so ambiguous?
Well, they both deal with contradicting hadiths, but they're treated really differently. Shad hadiths are pretty rare. They basically stand alone against a whole bunch of other hadiths on a specific topic, and you won't find that grade used in the major collections.
So those are like outliers that are pretty easy to just dismiss.
Pretty much. Mudtarib hadiths, on the other hand, those are a lot more common, and they're a real pain for scholars.
How so?
Well, it's basically when you have conflicting accounts that seem equally strong, so nobody can really agree on which version is the more reliable one.
I'm guessing these Mudtarib ones are found in those major collections.
Oh, yeah. And usually they come with a whole bunch of different opinions from different scholars about, how reliable they are. It's a whole mess.
I mean, it seems like even with this whole complicated grading system, there's still a lot of room for different interpretations and debate.
It definitely shows you how hard it can be to really rely on these ancient texts.
Yeah.
But I don't think that means we should just give up, Like engaging with these hadiths, I think it can still give you some really valuable insight into how Islamic thought developed.
So it's less about trying to find like the one right answer.
Yeah.
And more about just appreciating how complex and how nuanced all this really is.
Exactly. You got to go in with your eyes open, knowing that there isn't just one correct interpretation. And that's where understanding this grading system, even with all its problems,
Yeah.
that can actually be really helpful.
Right.
Because it lets you look at these hadiths and, question what you think you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And you can start having these more meaningful conversations about all the different ways that Muslims have understood their faith. It's not about just blindly accepting labels. It's about understanding why those judgments were made and recognizing that even those experts can disagree.
Okay, makes sense.
As we've been going through all of this,
Yeah.
it really strikes me that this whole idea of hadith grading it's really a way of dealing with uncertainty.
That's a really good point. I mean, you've got all these different grades and these chains of transmission that could be broken or questionable.
Right.
And then you factor in that even those authentic hadiths, they can sometimes contradict each other.
Exactly.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is. And I think that's part of why we see this tendency today to just kind of brush aside those Da'if hadiths,
Like it's too messy, it's too complicated.
Yeah. It's like people just want those clear-cut answers.
It's like a simple right or wrong.
Exactly. But as we've been seeing, it's so much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, the sources we've been looking at, they really make it clear that that kind of black and white thinking, it just doesn't make sense, especially when you consider the historical context.
You're absolutely right. Like if those scholars who compiled those early hadith collections,
Right.
if they truly believed that Da'if meant just throw it out, why would they have included them at all?
It doesn't add up.
It really doesn't. They were so careful about preserving those teachings of the Prophet,
Right.
So it doesn't make sense to think they'd just fill up their work with stuff they thought was worthless. They didn't just throw something out because it didn't meet those top standards of authenticity.
Yeah, they recognize that you can still gain knowledge and understanding from different sources, even those that might not be perfect.
Exactly. Well, think about it this way. Even those rejected hadiths can give us these glimpses into how religious thought has evolved over time.
Okay.
They're like windows into all those different ideas and beliefs that were floating around in those early Muslim communities.
Even if those ideas were eventually rejected.
Exactly. So it's not about taking every word as like the absolute truth.
Right.
It's more about recognizing that these texts are products of their time.
They show us that messy process of how religious ideas are formed and debated and then eventually, codified.
Exactly.
Can't forget that studying history and religion, it's not about looking for this perfectly polished narrative. It's about understanding that journey,
Yeah.
those messy debates, the ideas that were discarded. It's in those less explored parts of history that we often find those really interesting insights.
It's like exploring an ancient city, You wouldn't just want to see those grand palaces and temples. You'd want to wander down those back alleys.
Look at the ruins.
Yeah. And see those hidden corners that tell the real story of how that city came to be.
And the rejected hadiths, they're like those hidden corners.
Exactly. They give us that different perspective on how Islamic thought developed.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical context.
Yeah.
And how even those rejected hadiths can be valuable.
Right.
But there's another layer to this whole hadith grading thing that we need to unpack for our listener.
Okay.
It's this whole idea of individual judgment and how that shapes the way we understand and apply these texts.
Yeah.
Because even with this whole elaborate system of grading, there's still a lot of room for personal interpretation.
That's such an important point, and it really gets to the heart of why we're having this whole conversation.
Right. It's not just about memorizing grades.
No. We've been talking about how there isn't just one single Islam with one unified view. Even within a particular sect or school of thought, there's room for different interpretations, different ways of applying these ancient texts to modern life.
And that's where things get really interesting and potentially challenging, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Because it means there's no one right answer. No ultimate authority who can say, this is what this hadith means, and this is how you have to apply it.
Exactly. It takes away that certainty and puts the responsibility on each individual to actually engage with those texts in a thoughtful and critical way.
It's not just blind faith.
No, it's about reasoned engagement with these really complex ideas.
Yeah, it's like we've been given this really intricate puzzle, and we're tasked with piecing it together.
Right.
And even those pieces that seem like they don't fit at first, like those Da'if hadiths,
Yeah.
they might actually hold the key to unlocking a whole new section of the picture.
Yeah.
And that really challenges what we've been talking about, this idea that these religious texts are supposed to give us these like absolute unchanging truths. Because if interpretation is so fluid and personal, then how can the meaning be truly fixed? right?
That's a great question. And I think that's where this whole debate around Da'if hadiths becomes so interesting.
Yeah.
They really force us to confront that fact that
Right.
different interpretations exist.
People see things differently,
Yeah. And sometimes those perspectives might even contradict each other.
and that's okay.
Exactly.
It's okay.
It's like we've been, I don't know,
Yeah.
conditioned to think of religious texts as these like divine rule books
Mm-hmm.
where every single word is set in stone and
Right.
we have to follow it all to the letter.
Yeah, but when you really start to,
Look closer?
peel back those layers, you realize
It's much more complicated.
it's way more nuanced than that. Yeah.
Instead of just dismissing those contradictions or those differences in interpretation as like,
Mistakes.
yeah,
Or trying to pretend they're not there.
right,
What if we looked at those as, like,
opportunities
opportunities to see how thought has evolved?
within a religious tradition.
Right, to see how people's understanding has changed over time.
Exactly.
It's like acknowledging that these texts, as sacred as they might be to some people, are still ultimately products of their time.
Yes.
They reflect that historical context, those cultural influences,
Yeah.
and just this ongoing process of humans trying to,
Figure it out.
grapple with these big questions and try to make sense of the world around them.
We've been looking at this from, more of an academic perspective. But
Right.
even if you approach these texts from a place of faith, there's still value in that critical engagement.
And thinking critically.
Yeah, wrestling with those different interpretations, coming to your own conclusions.
Because at the end of the day, that's what makes studying religion or any complex system of knowledge so rewarding.
Yeah,
It's not about finding those right answers.
right.
It's about that journey of exploration and discovery.
Beautifully said.
Well, it's been such a pleasure exploring this topic with you. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure.